I am Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And we're paranormal specialists who live in the most haunted city on earth, Savannah, Georgia. Every day is Halloween in our line of work, so join us as we spin true tales of haunts, murders, and disturbing Savannah history. I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the most haunted city on earth. My name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And we are here with a very special guest. We have Emma all the way in, how do you pronounce the name of your town?
I am currently in Canterbury.
Canterbury. Awesome. Yep. So Emma is joining us from the UK, and she is the host of Real Life Ghost Stories podcast. So if you haven't listened to her, you definitely should, because she tells all sorts of interesting stories that happen to her fans, her patrons. She also talks about local lore and whatnot. So Emma, do you want to kind of introduce yourself a bit more?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm Emma. I'm obviously a podcaster, and I have a podcast called Real Life Ghost Stories, which does exactly what it says on the tin. So every Wednesday and Friday, I dive into some listener spooky stories and experiences that they've had. And then on a Sunday, I try and tackle a famous haunting or a famous haunted place or some folklore from other countries, and we try and do a deep dive into that.
That's so fun. I love it. I personally have listened to Emma for a while, and JT has also, because we love a good ghost story, obviously, since we're here. So it's super fun to listen to, different folk tales and, really doing a good research dive instead of just sometimes, going into theory. It's sometimes just nice to hear a good story. So Emma, I have some questions for you before we kind of dive into stories and things like that. But my biggest question is, since you've lived in both the UK and Ireland, which one do you think is more haunted, in your opinion?
I definitely think Ireland. I have to say Ireland. That's where my heart lies. That's where my roots are. And I think Irish people are born storytellers. It's in our blood, and we share ghost stories and we share stories of hauntings and fairy lore, although I don't like saying the F word, because every time I say the F word, things go wrong.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I literally tell this to JT all the time and he doesn't believe me about the fae. So, yeah.
Well, you can believe it or believe it not. But that's entirely up to you. But I just choose not to tempt fate with that one. And I have to say that every time I've done an episode about the fairies, things have gone wrong. Things that have never gone wrong before, technologically, have ended up going wrong. So I just don't like taking the risk. But we also have, we've lots of lore about things like the Banshee, and we tell those stories and we tell them all the time. But I have to say, living in England, I've lived in England for 10 years. Because there's such a rich history in England, there is also just an abundance of ghost stories from throughout the ages, really. Yeah. Well, I can imagine, the Celts had such a rich history of, being entrenched in Celtic magic and things like that. And there's so much just kind of mythical creatures associated with that culture. I can believe it. That sounds like such a fun place to grow up, because, it's very different than in the US, where we have, serial killers that you learn up growing up listening to, instead of, something like a fae or, the Banshee or things like that. So do you have a particular favorite story from Ireland? I love Banshee Lore. I'm a very skeptical person, but there's something about Banshee Lore that I just love. And anybody who tells me a Banshee story, I will automatically believe it. I will be like, okay, that is true. So I know when we kind of talked before we started filming this episode, when we had our creative meeting, you said that you were the least sensitive person to the paranormal.
But do you have a ghost story? Because I feel like even people who say they're not sensitive have experienced something that they could consider paranormal.
Hey, look, there's a reason that I'm sitting here doing this. There has to be, do you know? I'm not remotely sensitive at all. Like I could be like like you just saying about serial killers, I could be in a room full of serial killers and not know it. Do you know what I mean? I think my intuition just doesn't work. I think at some point in my life that switch was flicked off and it's never turned back on again. And I don't feel like I'm a sensitive person. I don't know if I wish that I was, because to being a paranormal podcaster, I get stories from people who are sensitive all of the time, and you know what? It sounds like a lot of really hard work.
Absolutely. Yeah, as somebody who is very sensitive and have been my entire life, it's exhausting. Yeah, I went into the Sorrel Weed House actually a couple nights ago for a secret project that y'all will find out about in a little bit, which is one of our more haunted houses here in Savannah. And the ghosts in that house, I swear, could just tell that I was sensitive, and they targeted me on this tour that I was taking. There was like this little girl spirit named Sarah who is in the house, and she's down in the basement area, and she likes to play hide and seek. Which is great when it's a kid ghost. I'm like, that's the last thing anybody wants with a child ghost, is something that hides from you. But the tour guide was, talking about all the medical things that happen in the surgery area of the basement, because that used to be where one of the sons of the Sorrel family, he would practice his medicine. And I just feel this little flutter on the back of my leg. And I'm like, that's weird. I'm like, is there a spider down here? I'm like, ew, like what's on my leg? And then I feel something literally grab my back pocket and like pull on me. And immediately the tour guide starts talking about Sarah, and she's like, oh yeah, Sarah likes to play hide and seek and things like that. And she usually, if you get close to where she's hiding and she thinks that you found her, she likes to grab onto your ankles or things like that, or she'll pull on your pant legs. And she said oftentimes when you're touched by a spirit, it feels like butterflies. And that's exactly what it felt like. It felt like butterflies on my skin, which is so interesting. But I was like, Sarah, why? I'm like, I'm trying to take notes over here. And like, she's like, you found me. And so you're probably better off not, experiencing things like that. Because some people experience things like that and they freak out.
I would be one of those people.
Yeah, I believe it. The tour guide said somebody else had experienced her, and he literally left the tour immediately screaming, because he was like, oh my God, a ghost grabbed my ankle. I'm done here. But yeah.
And I wonder as well, with people who are sensitive, like when you walk into a building, are you like lit up like a beacon? So that, and all of the ghosts and spirits that are in that building are like, oh, we've got one, finally.
Honestly, I could see that being a thing, because yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I've always theorized that, ghosts don't want to expend energy if they can't get something back, if they can't get attention back, if they can't get some kind of, recognition. And so when somebody who can see them or can, exchange energy with them, yeah, I think that would be a draw, just a moth to the flame kind of situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would completely agree with that, because there are also some spirits that are just dying for attention, and they're like, absolutely. Oh, you can see me? Great. I'm going to make good use of this.
I've always considered like human attention to be an amazing source of energy for a spirit, because I think spirits, the whole reason why they kind of linger around is for that living energy, the idea that life can still be accessible to them. They're not going to the next place, so they want to have some connective and connection to the living. And I think that becomes, very much the motivation of ghosts in my experience, is to somehow be perceived or recognized, their desire to be alive again, or to feel life again.
It's almost like I feel like ghosts revert back to being teenagers, just eternal teenagers who are slamming doors, banging around, making noises, trying to get attention, being generally annoyed at not being alive or at the living, whichever one it is.
That's actually a great analogy. Is ghosts are eternal teenagers.
Eternal teenagers.
That's what the title of the podcast will be, I guess. Now, I noticed a common theme with your podcast, and you literally had this written in your bio, that you hate aliens. What is it about aliens that you really don't like?
It's not a vibe, okay? It's just not a vibe. I hate aliens. I hate alien stories. Like, it gives me actual anxiety, like feelings of genuine fear when I watch alien movies, when I talk about alien stories. When somebody sends me in a story where they're like, it's anything alien related, I'm like, oh, I hate this so much. And I think a part of that is to do with the generational trauma of the scene in Signs where they're all at the kid's birthday party and the alien walks out of the hedge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you didn't know, Emma is a big horror movie buff like us, so we'll probably make plenty of horror movie references throughout this episode. But I could totally see, that being something that's so fearful, because we don't have a lot of information on aliens to a certain degree that has been given to us that hasn't been, classified information and stuff. But
no, and the other thing I think that is really fascinating about alien stories is that fundamentally, when you say you have a ghost story, whether or not people believe in ghosts, they won't ridicule your story. Right? So I'm pretty skeptical, but I have a ghost story, which I'll get to obviously at some point when I stop talking. But I'm skeptical, but I have a ghost story. When I tell people that story, nobody's ever gone, that's ridiculous. That's clearly a sign of you being unwell. However, if you're somebody who has an alien encounter, not seeing a UFO, because I think seeing a UFO is a pretty normalized thing now, but if you have an alien encounter, nobody is going to believe you.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. Although I will say, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's been more and more information coming out from the government, or at least the U.S. government, about alien encounters. JT, what was the article that you saw the other day about aliens that you're like, AP News, which is like a very reputable news source?
Yeah, AP dropped an article about these sightings that the military has seen, and they've confirmed that they are not human-made objects. That's what it was. Also, vote for Emma's podcast for the Irish Podcast Awards.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, please do. That'd be nice.
Yes, get Emma to the top of the Irish podcast. Yes, absolutely. But yeah, I thought that was so interesting, and I think it gives a lot of validity to people's stories, and they're not just people wearing tinfoil on their heads.
It's fascinating too.
No, they're not.
Exactly.
You'll also find a huge schism between the ghost crowd and the UFO crowd and the alien crowd. It's fascinating that a lot of people who are devout UFO people will just scoff and not believe in ghosts at all, and a lot of people who are in the ghost world will just scoff and not believe in aliens and all. And so I think there's room enough at the table because it's all unknown. Because the question is, we just don't know. And when you start dealing with the unknown, people will latch on to the thing that they feel is most likely. And it's like, there's probably a lot of crossover. There's probably a lot of crossover between alien encounter and old world ghost stories and old world superstitions. There might be a lot of crossover between, religious faith and UFOs and paranormal and ghosts. People are strangely dedicated to one camp or the other, and it's like there's probably room. There's probably room to say a lot of these things are about our perception and our ability to perceive, and not necessarily one or the other.
Yeah, definitely. And I find as a podcaster, so I've done this now for 4 years. I had to count that on my fingers because I wasn't sure, and I have to I only do a historical alien case every 5 months or so, because people get annoyed. They're like, oh, don't want to hear an alien story. But then there's, like you said, there's a group of people who are like, I love the alien stories. But it tends to be quite a small group, and like within the kind of ghostly paranormal community that like both. And then, as you said, there's the diehard UFO followers, I suppose is probably the best way to put it, who maybe don't believe in the ghost stories. It's a really interesting schism, and I don't quite understand it. I mean, I will always slag off a UFO story. I will always try and make light of it as much as possible for self-preservation, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, it is true. I've always noticed that as well, that people love to separate the two, but I'm like, if you believe in one thing, it would be kind of unfair to not believe at least
not
in the
ridicule,
exactly, or at least believe in the possibility of something of that nature, you know. And that's why we talk about things that are considered folklore. You know, we talk about all sorts of like cryptids and sorts of things like that. But
I even think that cryptids is a fascinating thing, because then you start moving into that whole concept, which is, what if there is more direct link to the idea of a spirit realm, a spirit world? You know, you talk about the Fae, all these things that may only intrude into our reality and then retreat into something that we can't understand or we don't know about. And those could be instances that we just miscategorize. We say, well, that's an animal. Bigfoot is an animal in the woods, and it could be some kind of Fae interloper or some kind of, you know, alien interloper. We don't know. And so it's weird that we that we choose a camp and we're like, nope, this is what it is, when we don't have any proof that, you know, no definitive answers. We only have a lot of observation, and people will take your observation and just decide that it's categorically wrong. It's like, it's an observation. It's what I gather from the evidence presented to me.
we're all just speculating.
It's a speculation. Yeah, absolutely.
But I would love to hear your ghost story, though. Yes. I love hearing ghost stories from people.
Oh, hold on to your hats for this one. This story is kind of, it is the reason why I started a paranormal podcast. I mean, I was always a bit of a spooky bitch, you know what I mean? I was a bit of a like weird kid, and I liked spooky things and ghost stories and horror movies and stuff, but kind of as a passing interest. I wasn't really particularly fascinated. I just thought it was vaguely interesting. Anyway, so I had an experience that I think really altered my perception of things. I don't know if it necessarily means that I believe every ghost story that I hear, because I do think there are fundamental human factors that mean that we interpret things in a certain way, right? But I've never been able to explain what happened to me. Never. And and it's sometimes when I think about it, it makes me, it really like I can't think about it too much, because if I think about it too deeply, I start to get a bit like existential crisisy, and nobody needs that, you know. So basically, when I was 17, I was still living in Ireland, and I started working in a building that was once called the Maryborough Lunatic Asylum. So it was built, I think, in the 1830s as a lunatic asylum, as was common at the time, and it really was not a pleasant place, you know. We read stories about lunatic asylums all the time, and they didn't know at the time how to treat mental illness, or even how mental illness like really presented itself in different ways, and it was a very dark place. And even, you know, when I worked there, older nurses would tell me stories about 20-30 years before that would, and those stories, those human stories, would make your hair stand on end. You know, it was a very unpleasant place for a very long time. And it used to have these huge, like 12-foot walls all around the building. And the building kind of operated like its own little village, like its own little town, as these buildings often did. It was quite self-sufficient. And people used to say that they would just hear screaming behind the walls, and nobody ever knew what was happening behind the walls or how these people's illnesses presented. And a lot of people were there with like intellectual disabilities, not just mental illnesses. So the people of the town had just saw these big walls and heard screaming, and didn't know what was happening. And obviously the use of medication, etc., was only a much later development. So when I started working there, I was 17, very naive. And the building was in use as a part of it was a psychiatric hospital, and the part that I worked in was a residential care home for adults with intellectual disabilities. So I worked on alternating between the male ward and the female ward, but it was all on the same 3 floors. And it was an experience, you know. It was a baptism of fire as a 17-year-old, and working with people with really extreme intellectual disabilities was very eye-opening. And of course, there was always the overwhelming feeling of eeriness about the place, because this building was enormous and it was separated into different buildings, and some of it was used and some of it was unused. And I knew there were like ghost stories about the place. There always had been. And my mum used to work in the building, so she had never experienced anything, but there were stories about the place. And one of the stories that used to go around, which is true, was that they had to bring a priest in to perform what's called an Exorcism Mass on the top floor of the building, because the staff were becoming increasingly reluctant to work the night shift. So at night time, the top floor, which was the 3rd floor, would always be empty and locked. It was only used during the day. But staff would regularly report hearing footsteps running around upstairs. They would hear furniture like banging, being moved around. Sometimes the staff would set the table for breakfast the night before, and they'd go up in the morning and all of the tableware would be off the tables, set up on the floor. There was just lots of stuff happened that really made people uncomfortable. And I think one of the final straws was when 2 nurses were working, and one of them told me this story himself, so this isn't like third-hand information. They were working and they heard all these noises on the top floor, and the 2 of them, as big grown men, they said, you know what, we're just going to go up there, we're going to see what's happening. And they went up onto the 3rd floor, and on the wall there was a panel of switches where all the lights were controlled from. And this nurse told me, he said he stood and he watched as the lights flicked off one by one from the furthest part of the building towards them. And he was thinking, oh, this is not good. This is not good at all. And then the furniture started moving. So they just abandoned ship, locked the doors, and they were like, right, that's it. We've looked, we've done our duty. We're not doing it anymore. And so they got a priest in, a local priest who was kind of au fait with the things that were paranormal in the community. And he said, yeah, that's fine. I'll come in and do a blessing. And things seemed to calm down. And I used to work on that floor on my own all of the time. I used to, like, first thing in the morning, on winter's mornings, it'd be pitch dark and I'd be up there on my own milling around. And I never really experienced anything or heard anything, but there was parts of the building that would have really eerie feelings, like feelings that would make you go, oh, I don't like that. And as a non-sensitive person, I would be like, there'd be points where I'd be walking down a corridor and then suddenly I'd be sprinting and not able to really really able to rationalize why I was doing it. And people would tell stories about patients at nighttime. So there would be certain rooms that patients would refuse to sleep in, like literally years and years of different patients would refuse point blank to sleep in this one particular room because they would say that people were in the room with them and all sorts of strange things. But it was, you know, like I said, I never really experienced anything, and I worked there for a long time. It was like 5 years that I worked there. And eventually one Monday morning I was in work and it was snowing. And I was standing outside having a cigarette, and I'd snuck out to have a cigarette, and that because I was like trying to hide around a corner, and another girl was with me. And while we were standing having a cigarette, I looked up into the 3rd floor window of one of the buildings, and there was a woman staring straight back at me. And I didn't really understand it at the time, but my stomach immediately swooped like I'd gone over a bridge, you know. And I looked at her, and I suppose we made eye contact for about 10 seconds, and then she drifted away from the window. And I thought, oh, something about this doesn't feel right. But my brain hadn't fully caught up yet. And then my brain did catch up, and my brain realized that what I had seen was a woman. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't something that was, a momentary glance. Like we looked at each other. She saw me and I saw her. And she had long black hair and some sort of white dress, but she had, I can only describe it as black shadows where her eyes should be. And all of this realization happened in the space of like a few seconds. And the next thing I realized, the girl that was standing next to me had ran. And she ran and was trying to get her key into the door. And I was like, what is wrong? What is happening? And she said, did you not just see that woman? And I was like, well, actually, I did just see that woman. Oh, God. So we ran. I continued running as well because it was the easiest thing to do. And I decided, no, stop, calm down. You can't freak out about this. And I decided to go and get security because the thing was the building that I saw her in was locked for the weekend. It was an office building. It was 100% locked for the weekend. It was a bank holiday Monday, which is, a day where office workers aren't in work. So I thought, oh, if I've actually just seen somebody in that building, that is not good news because there's not meant to be anybody in there. So I went and got security and I said, look, I think there's somebody in the child and family building. And he was like, no, there isn't. And I said, look, right, I have just seen somebody in there, so can you please go and check? And he went, no, there isn't. There's nobody scheduled to be in there. The building's locked. And I was like, okay, I understand that, but can you please go and check? So he went and checked. All of the doors were code locked, which meant that if anybody tried the doors, an alarm would have gone off. There was nobody scheduled to be in there. And it was, it was a really sort of defining moment, right? And I thought, oh, that is the weirdest thing. Have I just seen a ghost? That's so strange. And kind of life continues as it does. And I remember at the time I told the nurse that was in charge on the day, I told her what happened and she was like, nope, no more. Don't want to hear it. Not happening. So maybe it was about a year later, there was a conversation on the ward about just general ghost stories. And I was telling people what had happened that morning. And one of the nurses said to me, stop for a second, and he rolled up his sleeve and his whole arm was out in goosebumps and his hairs were all standing on end. And he said, I've seen her. And I was like, oh no, please don't validate this story because I don't need that. And he had worked the night shift for a really long time and he would work the night shift on the female ward. And he said that in the beginning, he obviously took it very seriously and was really concerned because he would see a woman run by the nurse's station at nighttime in a white dress with long black hair. And he would obviously think it was one of our patients, it was one of the service users. So he would go and check and everyone would still be in their beds. And eventually he was like, I don't think this is a real person. I think this might be something else. But yeah, so he saw her too. And I'm sure lots of other people did. If I went back and spoke to people in that building, I think lots of other people would have had the same experience.
That's fascinating. I love a good lunatic asylum story. It's that is so creepy. Just picturing that kind of entity. Now, did anybody have any kind of like aggressive sort of encounters with her, or was it always just sort of just a passing by sort of situation?
No idea. So I don't know how to explain this, but seeing her, it did not feel good. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? It
Yes,
wasn't
yes.
like I'm seeing something that is an echo in time and it's completely, it's completely fine. It's not anything that is malicious. It didn't feel good when I saw her. And I don't think the nurse that I had been speaking to about it, who had seen the same woman, I don't think he had any kind of experience with her other than her running by the nurse's station multiple times. And I don't know about anybody else because we sort of operated almost like it was two different hospitals. It was like so I didn't really speak to the people from the other units. So, I mean, there could have been plenty of people who had an experience with her.
Yeah. It's something about like a mental institution that really attracts spirits, it feels like.
Well, I oftentimes think about what it is perception-wise that defines reality and what defines the world as most people agree upon it. And in cases of people who are deemed insane or deemed mentally unfit, they may be at a wider perception level, or they may be more open and receptive, or not even receptive. They may be bombarded by things that we don't perceive or we don't understand. There may be people, who are so sensitive, in fact, that they are consistently and constantly just under this barrage of supernatural, preternatural, things that are happening. And, if you wake up one morning and you're surrounded by people that no one else can see, and you tell somebody, I can see all these people, you're probably going to end up in a hospital. You're probably going to end up in one of these institutions. And the further into a perception that no one agrees with, the more insane you will appear. So the idea of putting someone in an insane asylum who might just be hyper-perceptive puts you in a weird place, because then their ability to judge what is real versus what is not becomes blurred. And then even in death, you might be dealing with people who don't accept life the way it is, and thereby they go on with the type of perception that they always had. I find it interesting that you have that unwell sensation. You see something and you're like, I know that ultimately this is a dark experience. There's no outward show of aggression. There's no, she's not screaming or running at me or bleeding from the eyes, but I feel unsettled. And I think that is like the schism between the reality and the reality you're about to know. You're literally stepping over something that many people will never experience, and a lot of people will just flat out deny. You're literally seeing something that says to you, oh, by the way, the universe isn't the way you've always seen it. The world isn't the way you've always known it. And we coined the term ghost heroin, ghosts are heroin, because the idea is when you get that first hit, when you see something that fundamentally rewrites the definition of the world as you know it, you are hooked. You then become a person who seeks it out. You then become a person who chases it down. You're always chasing down that sensation, that first sensation where you're like, my worldview changed like a switch of a light switch. You all of a sudden, what I thought wasn't possible is possible, and now I have to go and see what else is possible.
Absolutely. What I found interesting is that you said she was a younger girl who had a white dress, long black hair, and it looked like she had no eyes. Because there's been plenty of other places that have had history of people who lived there or, were institutionalized there who had mental illness, and they report seeing girls like that, including the Sorrel Weed House, which actually that's kind of at the forefront of my brain right now in the history of Savannah, because I just was there. But they have a photo, and I'll insert it here, but it's of a little girl that basically they caught standing between two other girls in one of the parlor rooms, and she has long black hair, it looks like she has no eyes, and she's wearing a white dress. And that house has a deep history of mental illness.
Oh, yes.
With Matilda Sorrel, who struggled with depression, and she ended up committing suicide, allegedly, as far as we can tell from history. But also, it has a deep history of horrendous deaths.
Oh, yeah.
Including Matilda Ann, who died of scarlet fever, who they believe that girl might have been. But it makes me wonder if sometimes when spirits die of these mental illnesses, kind of in the way that, how in Asian folklore, they become these creatures of sorts.
That specific spirit definition, the description of the spirit is so prevalent all around the world. Wherever you go in the world, there is the long, dark-haired, white nightgown, sunken eye spirit. And in a lot of cases, they have, and I call them jobs. Some spirits have jobs, kind of like the Banshee. They have a purpose. Their purpose, can be defined by, if you see this spirit, X is going to happen. If you encounter this spirit, it's some bad, it's an omen of something bad to come. The woman in black, a child is going to die in your family. The woman in white, you're going to get into an accident. Things like that, just harbingers, as it were. And which begs the question: is there like a placement agency in the afterworld that's like, oh well, you're going to be a banshee, and you're going to be a woman in white, and you're going to be a woman in black, because of the conditions of their lives and their deaths. Is it possible that they fall into, cliches happen because of their regularity, because people can attest to having these things happen regularly enough that they become cliche, that people are like, oh, well, that's a cliche. It's like, well, it didn't become a cliche by not happening, by never being observed. They became cliche because they were repeated, and then everyone was like, oh yeah, I accept that if I see X, Y, or Z, it means this. And I oftentimes think about how the spiritual world and spiritual encounters oftentimes become what people use to define the accidents and the occurrences after the fact. If I saw this ghost and then this happened, this happened because I saw this ghost, or I mentioned the Fae, and therefore these bad things happen. It's so interesting that we are still in the throes of understanding that when something beyond our normal scope happens, we place all this significance on it. And then, of course, we can see these ghosts, these very, intriguing. I actually had an experience with, and I to this day, I don't know whether it was a ghost or just a woman, but, late at night on a dirt road, I encountered the long, dark hair. I couldn't see her eyes because of, the lighting. It was late at night. But when I saw her inside, I was like, oh. But, you don't want to do that to a person's face. That's just rude. So, but I ended up like literally screaming in her face, and we drove off. But I had that notion where it's like, well, that was just, a textbook ghost. Pale skin, and eyes sunken in, and long hair that just kind of hung from the head, and I would say that was a textbook ghost.
Yeah, the Samara syndrome.
The Samara syndrome. Yeah. And Samara was developed because there were so many ghost stories, and so many, because that is the prevalent ghost, the spooky kid ghost.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was actually funny when I stayed after the tour at the Sorrel Weed House, and she was letting me gather the photos that she showed and whatnot. And she told me, she was like, it's funny that the ghost with the little girl with the long black hair and the white gown, we have a well on the property. And she looks just like Samara. And I was like, well, I wonder if,
Sure.
But yeah, it's interesting also, since we've kind of talked about Fae a bit, how there's so many creatures that could be considered Fae in modern folklore. Are you familiar with the Black-Eyed Children?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. So we just talked about this recently. The episode hasn't come out, but I made an argument that I feel like the Black-Eyed Children could be a type of Fae of some sort.
Right. They're requesting entrance into your home. They require you to invite them in. There's all kinds of parallels.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
As somebody who's lived in a country where, Fae were kind of brought to life with the folklore, what's your opinion on that? Because this is just a theory of mine.
I'm going to say that I disagree.
Okay.
The first reason being is that I love stories about black-eyed kids, but they have a distinct air of creepypasta that sort of reminds me of, the stories of the Rake.
Yes.
And the Rake ended up actually being a creepypasta that was kind of adopted, and people in the mainstream were like, oh, that describes the thing that I saw, you know? So like, while the story of the Rake itself was made up, it kind of spoke to people, because suddenly people were like, I saw something similar. Is it this thing called the Rake? Anyway, so I think Black Eyed Kids are really interesting, because I don't quite understand their context or why. The why behind them kind of baffles me a little bit. Whereas my understanding of the Fae is that they don't really care for people. They don't really care about humans. They're not really interested in us. You know, for Irish people, the Fae were driven underground in an agreement, because they said, okay, we'll go, but leave us alone, or you will suffer the consequences. So in my experience, it's sort of one of those things where they're not interested in people. They're not going to come knocking at your door, but leave us alone, and we will leave you alone, rather than come and knocking on your door to do what? That's the thing about Black Eyed Children. What do they do when they get in? See, this is the problem. If they came to my door, I'd be like, don't let them in, but also I kind of want to know what you're going to do, so maybe I'll let you in.
Right?
You know, to me, it harkens on the changeling, the concept of the changeling story, which is kind of if I can get into your home, I can become human or hide as human. I can, I can root in and then become this thing, because the concept of that faction, the divide, where the Fae said, this is our realm, that is your realm. The agreement is set, is that there are always going to be outliers. There's always going to be the stories, and then of course you've got the myriad of goblins and other things that are actively seeking to torment humans, that are actively seeking to do damage and do harm. And so, when like thinking, is this kind of like in the Fae universe, it certainly is like the stepchild. It's certainly like oh, this is the redheaded stepchild of this of these stories. This one kind of comes in, because it does smack of that creepypasta, that kind of, because it just like popped up out of nowhere.
It was that one guy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The story about the gas station,
right?
Or the cinema.
Kid approaching
it was
him.
The movie theater. He was writing out his check.
Right.
Brian starts with a last name starts with a B.
Mm-hmm.
But that guy. He basically in 1998 or something like that, he basically was at a movie theater that was right next door to where he had to drop off his bill, and so he was using the movie theater lights from the marquee to write out his check. And that's when the kids walked up and were like, we wanted to see Mortal Kombat, but we don't have money, let us in your car. And the thing that made me feel like they could have been Fae was the fact that they had to be invited in, that they could not cross the threshold unless you allowed them in. Now, this could also be because I have Appalachian roots, where, it's also similar things like that, like don't welcome things into your house,
when you think of like displaced Fae, that concept, the concept of people, the immigrants that came into the country, being somehow seeding old world creatures and habits into this new world, and they having to adapt to a world that has a totally different landscape and totally different environment with totally different cultures clashing. It raises a lot of questions, when you're dealing with a mass exodus from a country. What traditions, what beliefs, what comes with them, and how much does belief foster and continue the powers and strengths of these things? Can the Fae truly survive without the faction of people who still honor and believe them? What is the connection to the world and how they exist? Because there's no real clear indication as to whether or not they are separate in our reality or dependent on our reality. Whether their existence depends on a faction of humanity that will still observe and knock on wood, do these little traditional and long lost reasons for acting or a specific pattern that keeps them slightly nourished in our realm. And they may not have realized it either. You know, the Fae may not realize their dependence on us, regardless of how much they want to avoid us. They may now realize, without enough concentration from the general populace, I think spirits could starve. I think that these things could conceivably, I've had a long-standing belief that reality is a consensus. That the more people who believe in something, the more real that thing is. And at one time, the Fae were so powerful because everyone believed. And then as belief shrank, maybe they started to starve. Maybe they needed to branch out. Maybe they needed to become some other type of entity that people will pay attention to and will believe in. However, I mean, again, wild conjecture, but it does beg those questions, like what did happen to these highly prevalent entities that people regarded, and people were like, well, science came, and people, and we explained that none of these things happened. It's like, well, did they not happen, or did we step away from them, or did we abandon them to a wilderness that is beyond our scope of consensus? We stopped believing as a group. I mean, the wild amount of executions and persecutions, and we literally drove magic out of our society by criminalizing it and by punishing it and by asserting a reality, by adopting a new source of faith and belief that did not include those things, and those things became fringe, and they became horrible and dark and black, and we maligned it for so long that I have to believe that had a horrible effect on our ability to perceive or interact with things greater or beyond the nature that we accept.
Really interestingly, and I think this would actually, you guys would quite enjoy it. There weren't many, there was only a handful of witch trials in Ireland. Very little, because people just accepted that witchcraft was something that could live alongside Christianity and later Catholicism. So even now, to this day in Ireland, there is a really weird, like, parallel belief in Christianity, Catholicism, and also in the old ways. Like, one of the things that I love telling people about is that a lot of people in Ireland, members of my own family included, believe in people having the cure. So we will say, oh, somebody, if somebody got, an illness. So my mum, for example, had shingles, and she was taken to a woman who had the cure of fire, which was the cure to get rid of shingles. And my mum was like, listen, I don't know what happened, but it worked. Okay, whatever she did, she cured my shingles. And there is still like a very strongly held modern day belief in those old ways.
And you'll find that in certain areas. I know all around New Orleans, there's I had a friend who had scarlet fever when he was a child, and they took him out into the boonies, out into the bayou, and to this woman who apparently completely healed him of his illness, and subsequently he was plagued with the ability to see and the ability to express. And he told me that he believed that it was his interaction with that woman and whatever she had done had flicked a switch inside of him, had turned it on. And now he was a beacon, and now he had all this things. But I hear that story a lot. Yeah. Around here in the Gullah Geechee tradition, there's a lot of healers and root doctors and things of that nature.
Well, and I think too, interestingly enough, in Appalachia, it's always been there, but it's risen back for people reconnecting to their Celtic roots, because most of the settlers that were in Appalachia were from Scotland, Ireland, England, places like that. They have that innate nature in them to bring back those belief systems. But so many people are starting to come out saying that I'm a healer. Like, it's now kind of a known name, at least with me, because I'm very much still so connected to that, is the Appalachian Mountain Witch. Yeah. Who uses the land to heal people and make medicine and things like that. But I also wonder, in just like a historical sense, Appalachia used to be connected to Scotland and Ireland at one point when it was Pangea. And so I wonder if some of the,
just the earth itself,
just the earth
land
itself
and
naturally
the
lends
minerals and
lends to why there's similar connections in that region to what's over in the UK and Ireland. And maybe that's why people have experiences that lean towards similar interactions with fae and creatures that live in the woods in, Irish and Scottish folklore and things like that. People have similar experiences but call it a different name.
Well, and it's interesting too to think of the fact that a lot of the immigration that occurred early on was duress. People in duress, fleeing famine and coming across the ocean. Which, when you're in a new world, your ties you really do double down on what makes you feel like home and what could be home. And I think that gives way to superstition in the sense of those traditions and those beliefs. I'm going to hold on to the good and the bad. I'm going to anything that feels like home. They're going to embrace and they're going to hold and they're going to pass on. They're going to teach their children and their children's children in the new world, so that some part of the new world will be representative of the place they left, the home that they loved. So, and I think that really does make everything connective. When you start to say, because even the idea of the black-eyed kids, there's a connective thing. Something is strumming at a point of connection in our consciousness, in our minds. We're thinking,
absolutely.
Oh, I kind of recognize that. I kind of see that. I think that's how urban legends become so easy to embrace and pass along, is because they're usually rooted in something familiar. There's always this thing like the Rake and Slender Man and all those things. There's this idea of, I've seen something like that, I've felt something like that, I've heard something like that. Especially when you deal with any stories where you're talking about children in peril. The children in peril paradox is, we all fear for children. And so if you create a creature that feeds on children, we're apt to at least entertain the idea, because we fear for children instinctively.
Yeah.
We are geared to do that, which also incidentally makes children very scary when they are the ghost, or when they are the creature,
or just in general.
Yeah.
Well, children are scary.
They're
things.
just creepy.
Yeah,
They are.
they're
It's a
easily
fact.
creepy.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that, that is the common thorough line, with black-eyed kids, is that people are like, it's snowing outside. It's like a really harsh condition outside.
Or they're alone in some isolated place. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, it plays on people's morals too, where it's like, do I let this kid freeze outside, or do I let them in, even though my instincts are telling me, everything inside of me is telling me, like, don't trust this kid for some reason. Yeah. JT, when we talked about this in the episode, you guys will hear that in a couple days, or on Patreon if you want to watch it already. But JT was immediately like, no, I would never let the kid in. Like, no, there's no way I'm letting that kid in. Sorry, don't knock on my door at midnight, But most people, though, especially the people who have children who've experienced them, they're the ones that have the worst dilemma with it.
It's a very huge dilemma.
Yeah.
Even creepy kids probably don't deserve to freeze to death.
Yeah.
Ideally, maybe.
Allegedly.
I don't know. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure. I don't have any sensitivities, but what I do have is a lot of phobias.
That's me too. We can work with that.
I survive by, and that's my superpower. I'm afraid of everything. I'm always afraid, and that gives me, an incredible amount of. Did I hear that? Did I see that? What was that? What's going on? I don't know. Sometimes people are like, "Wow, you're really sensitive." So, no. I'm hyper vigilant, is what I am.
I'm very anxious
I'm
all
very
the time.
anxious. And if I open the door and there's a little child with just black eyes going, "Let me in," I'd be like, "No, I'm sorry."
See, I just need to know.
Or I'd let them in and move. I just leave.
Yeah, you let them in the front door and just walk straight out the back door and be like, this is yours now.
It's like, this house is done.
I just want to know, like, I want to know what is it they do inside the house. I want to know. So if you let them in and they're like, oh, we hadn't thought this far ahead. I don't know, death or something. I don't know.
Well, it's really interesting because I went on a long tangent for a few years about selling your soul to the devil. And one of the interesting things that I found in certain accounts was there is no contract. You don't sign something. It's if you accept anything at all from the devil, you've exchanged your soul. So, if some stranger comes up to you and is like, hey, want a stick of gum? And you take that stick of gum, you've just exchanged your soul for a stick of gum. The devil, if you take anything from the devil, and I was like, well, where does that come from? What is that rule? And it is this idea of exchange. If you give anything to one of these entities, you have entered into a relationship. You are now forever and eternally bonded. And in many cases, that is kind of the dream of curses and hexes and vampirism and all these ideas. We're going to exchange something. So it's possible that by helping a black-eyed child, you're taking on the burden of whatever's cursed them, of whatever has put them into that situation. And, that's just like a weird amalgam of superstitions that suggest that the interaction, somebody asks you for something and you reciprocate, you are now linked, you're now lodged. Now the parasitic activity begins. It lives off of you. You've given it egress into your existence. And not to say that that's what the black-eyed child is, but it does speak to the idea of what is the menace and why do we feel menace when we hear it? Because you're right. There's no account of letting the black-eyed child in and then what? They rip off their skin and eat you? What then happens? But the very notion that the request to enter your home gives them power over you. I mean, that's the Dracula, you have to invite the vampire into your home. Otherwise, and in most occasions, it's when you invite a vampire into your home, you have no power over it. You can no longer use any of your tricks to harm it. And that might be the question. Maybe these children just need a place where they don't feel threatened. Let me in, and if you let them in, you no longer have the ability to harm them. However, it is just kind of a goofy, weird, new urban legend.
Yeah.
It's so new that you kind of give it this sort of, well, props to you for coming up with something
Oh,
creepy
yeah.
that people will repeat
For a long time.
and from here on out, there was a Adventure Time cartoon about the black-eyed kids. So there's the fact that you can get a story to that level of common speech. You go creepypasta.
Yeah.
Do you know what I feel like? I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I feel a very serious Netflix 6-part series about us hunting for the black-eyed kids. Let's go all the way back to the origins of the story, find those kids, or kind of preferably not. I don't know which I want to happen. Maybe find them. I don't know.
JT is looking at me like, absolutely. He's giving the face of like, yes.
Yeah, that means there's like some 30-year-old guy who's like, man, I just wanted a ride home.
Right.
And he's like, I've got an ocular condition, all right?
Yeah. Honestly, though, I still stick to the fact that if I ever do have 2 children, I am going to dress them up as the black-eyed children. And I'm going to send them out every Halloween. I'm like, go scare as many people as you can.
Just ask to go into the house. Don't say trick or treat. Just be like, can I come in?
They're like, you have to let us in. You have to.
Yeah, you got it. You're going to have to like train them to do that perfect deadpan voice. Yeah. For years, and then eventually when you just let them loose, and you'll have like all the message boards in your local area will be like ping 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 ping, the weirdest thing just happened to me.
Yeah, you send them out the day after Halloween.
Yes.
November 1st.
Yes.
Send them out.
For sure.
It's like, oh, Halloween was yesterday. Let us in.
Let us in. Woo-hoo-hoo. I love it. All right. Well, on that note, we're going to go ahead and start wrapping things up. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us, Emma. You were just a delight.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. I do have a film recommendation for you.
Yes.
And for your listeners, if you like a bit of fairy lore and changeling lore, there is an Irish film called You Are Not My Mother, which is a very modern take on changeling lore, and that sort of, it leans into those ideas that, you know, old thoughts about changelings were actually people with mental illnesses and etc. It messed me up for quite a while, actually. It's very good.
I love that.
Awesome.
I am absolutely going to be watching that ASAP. So is JT. But yes. So awesome. Well, let's go ahead and also talk about that we are going to have an episode over on Emma's podcast. So if you enjoyed this portion of these two-part series, I guess, between our two channels, definitely go to check out Emma's podcast episode with us. We're going to talk about some stories and things like that over there, right? So
Absolutely. I'm excited.
yeah, absolutely. Emma, do you have anything you want to plug before we wrap up?
Come and listen to the podcast. It's Real Life Ghost Stories. You can find it anywhere that you find your podcasts. I also have a TikTok, which I'm very sorry if you follow me on TikTok. I just sorely neglected. I just forget all the time. So if you kind of prefer things to be bite-sized, I do put up stuff on TikTok every so often. So please come and have a listen. I release episodes 3 times a week. So there's loads of content to catch up on.
Awesome. Yeah, there is. There's plenty of content over there and so many interesting stories. So definitely check that out. Also, if you are not already a patron, definitely consider becoming one of our patrons. We have exclusive episodes that go up over there. We've got some really interesting ones coming up soon. Also vlogs and stuff like that. If you just enjoy watching JT and I banter with our dogs, that's a fun time. Also, you get early access to literally every episode. So it's super cool. Definitely check that out. We're at patreon.com/Savannah Underground. Also, if you want even more content from us about ghosts, go ahead and check out our secondary podcast with just JT and I called From One to Wicked. It is going to be, you know, more so we talk about all the malevolent spirits from around the world and we rate them on a scale of 1 to wicked. So definitely check that out. As always, check out our TikTok and our Instagram. And like I said, check out Emma's podcast. You guys will not regret it. Trust me, you're going to be loaded with ghost content with all of this. So with that being said, we appreciate you guys so much, and we will see you in the next episode. So my name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susi.
And stay spooky, y'all.